we can do is sum up, is sort of draw up the ghost of Grover Cleveland, and we're not really, not really selling some successful leaders that much. So where are all the best men going? They're going to the corporate world. They're not going to the political world. In fact, during this period, it was seen as sort of shameful to be a politician. Politicians are people who had to beg for support. Politicians are people who had to please the public. Wall Street executives really ran the country. That's how they perceived it, and I think that's an accurate statement. I think that you're going to see an ebb and flow of that narrative, because what's going to happen is we're going to have a president, or have several presidents, one in particular named Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to remind the American corporate world that no one is above the United States government. You understand? So we do have this debate about who is more powerful, but I think it would be hard pressed in 1880s or 90s to say that the government was more powerful than corporations. I think the corporations were more powerful. You know, when J.P. Morgan has to bail out the federal government, that should give you a sense of priorities as far as who was ranking who, right? So the most skilled, most effective, often the most educated people, educated in terms of business savvy, would go into the corporate world. All right. And so this is going to be like a spectacular growth in industry. This is, you know, until we get to the 1950s, an unheralded period of absolute wealth creation. So as much as I don't think capitalism is patriotic, I absolutely believe it's the best engine ever invented by man to create wealth. You know, capitalism is going to make money, and it's going to make a lot of people money. And so this is a period where Americans really start to see that. You're going to have the rise of a middle class for the first time, like a real middle class, and just not a yeomanry. And so at the core of all of this is going to start with a railroad. So the railroads are going to energize a fairly tepid industrial activity. If you think about pre-Civil War, the major industry of the pre-Civil War was textiles. And it had sort of plateaued in terms of, yes, they're going to still make textiles forever, you know, but how many factories could you possibly make having textiles? And iron mining was a business. But once you had the signing of the Pacific Railroad Act, it became pretty clear that this was going to be the way of the future. Now, the question should be, and it should always be the question, whenever I listen to anything the government suggests, this is one of the things I ask, is what the government is providing better provided by the private sector? Okay, so for example, one of the reasons why I am much more of a fan of the hospital we used to have was it was a community hospital owned by the community, a not-for-profit hospital. I consider healthcare an industry that shouldn't be for profit, you know, because you're putting people's lives on the line for profit. I think the same thing about education. I don't think education should be a for-profit business. Right. You have to calculate that, and I'm just not a fan of it. But the question came about the railroad, and so the question should be, why didn't the titans of industry just build a railroad? Why did the government have to get involved? Well, first of all, there was no money in it. It takes years and years to build a railroad, which means if you were going to build a railroad for perhaps a decade, you were not going to make any profit. All right, this is definitely a long-term capital investment, and the guys that would ultimately build the railroads were not interested in putting up capital for something that wasn't going to yield a profit for a very long time. So enter the federal government, and the federal government did have a reason for the United States to need railroads. The obvious reason was the failure of the Pony Express to keep up with the growth of the West. We needed to deliver the mail. That's actually a constitutional responsibility. So the federal government has to provide what's called post roads. And in the case of getting to California, that would be best served by a railroad. So I put the Pony Express up there just to tell you that those guys didn't last very long. They just weren't capable of delivering enough mail to the western coast. The other, though, was the Civil War itself. During the Civil War, it was clear that it was going to be hard to transport American troops to places where they might be needed, like, say, California. In other words, there was no method of transporting the army beyond regionally in the East. And so they recognized pretty clearly on that we would need to have a way to get the American military from point A to point B. So there you have your reason, you know, to connect the nation. There's also a psychological reason. You think about California being 1,800 miles away from the nearest town outside of the West. that was like being on the moon. Okay, that was because it was on the other side of two sets of mountain ranges. And they felt like Lincoln, particularly, was a huge fan of this idea. Lincoln felt like the best way to connect California to the rest of the country had to be through railroads. So we've talked about this before with Jeff Davis and the Gadsden Purchase. Remember that down here? So the question becomes, how does the federal government help fund railroads? So if you understand, the government was fairly cash short, as you might recall. So they're not going to do too much of this. They don't want to really give what are called cash infusions. So how then could they fund a railroad without giving them money? Well, that's right. What they came up with were where the railroads would be built, they would take a square mile on either side of the railroad. Okay. So a mile one side, a mile the other. And they would chop that up into other square miles. So mile each, like each one of these blocks are a square mile. And so what you see here is the government would hold one of them, and they would then give the grant of land to the railroads. So they're just literally giving land to the railroads. Now the land's not worth anything. I mean, this is, not, at least not at the moment. This is land in western Nebraska and Wyoming, Colorado. At the time, that's not worth anything, at least other than the Native Americans. So what this would do is, as the railroad would grow, they would be able to determine where the land would be sold from. So as the railroad came through the area, the value of that land beside it would skyrocket because you wanted your town beside the railroad, just like today, the interstate or near the interstate, right? So that meant that most of the land sold during the great land boom of the 1870s and 80s would be sold by the railroad to the public. So this is the federal government giving the land away to the railroad companies in exchange for them building the railroads. Okay, so they really, I'm not going to say they never gave any cash infusions like direct, but rarely would they do that, just simply because they didn't have much money. And so that meant these square miles would become very, very valuable land. Okay. Now the first railroad is going to be established in Nebraska, right? So if you look here, they were trying to connect it to existing railroads in Illinois. And a fella named Grenville Dodge, that's him, had been out figuring out what the best place to run the line would be. And so the key thing you need to recognize about the first company is that it was called the Union Pacific. And I think about that. It's during the Civil War, right? So it's the Union. It's run by a Union general. And it's coming out of the Great Plains in Nebraska. And this is going to be built primarily by Civil War veterans and a whole lot of Irishmen. They're going to build, and there's a race. There was a race. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroad would be given land the more they got, the further they got. Okay. Then in California, you had another group, and they wanted to also build the Transcontinental Railroad. So if you see up here, the Pacific Railroad Act awards a contract to two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. Central coming out of California, maybe you can remember it that way. Union coming, from the Union. So the Central Pacific is run by a group called the Big Four. Really run out of a guy named Charlie Crocker's General Store. He owned one of these big like Dollar Generals of his day, right? But the guy who's the face of this company is Governor Leland Stanford. Now, this is the guy whose son, when he dies, Stanford has so much money from the railroad that he endows the Harvard of the West. So if you've ever heard of Stanford University in California, that's named after Leland Stanford's son, who passed away. So the Big Four want to build the railroad over both the Sierra Nevada mountains and the Pacific Coast Range, which means they're going to have to go through this. Now, I know this doesn't look particularly bad on this map. These are some of the highest mountains in the lower 48. Okay, very, very tough, and they're made out of solid granite. Obviously, they're mountains, So you're going to have TNT to blow holes through these mountains. Even the Irish people don't want to do it. They don't want to blow holes in mountains with TNT. Plus, they have these enormous snows that cover the entire rail. So that's why they start building snow sheds. That's what these are. So they could keep working in avalanche, level snow. And of course, most notably is the importation of thousands of Chinese workers. Apparently Charlie Crocker said these guys built the Great Wall, didn't they? They could build our railroad. And so they brought these guys in from a particular province in China. And they were tremendous workers. And so the Chinese helped build the Central Pacific primarily, and the Irish, primarily with veterans, built the Union Pacific. And under schedule and under budget, it is completed successfully in 1869. Even in spite of Crédit Mobilier and other scandals, this is run very effectively. And so within, basically 6 years of start, it is built. This is a very famous point in Utah. It's in Ogden, Utah. They call it Promontory Point. Stanford would drive in the ceremonial spike. He actually needed practice, and his first attempt he missed. There's not it's like getting a corporate guy out there to do something that the worker bees have to do. Thousands of people are going to die building the Transcontinental Railroad. I want to point that out. This is going to involve, they used to joke and say that under every railroad tie was a dead Irishman. Because the speed and pace that they're going is highly risky. All right. Plus, you have hundreds of Chinese people die with explosions from TNT. This is nitroglycerin being used for the first time in history. Yeah, in liquid form. So this was, and there's a great series that if you were here, I'd show it to you. It's called The Makers of America, and it's the story of us. It's called, and it has how these railroads were connected and built. Quite an extraordinary, one of the great accomplishments in American technological history and human history. It was a really extraordinary thing, because once you did this, it cut this voyage to California down to a couple days, which once had taken months, right? It took weeks. It took a month to go overland. It took months to go around Cape Horn. So big change. So 4 of the railroads are going to be awarded land grant subsidies, since they can't afford to build a railroad without it, they say. One of these railroads that are going to be created will not be subsidized, and that's quite an accomplishment when you consider it. But here you'll see the original Transcontinental Railroad, the Central and Union Pacific. Here you see the Southern Pacific running through where Jeff Davis wanted it, Gadsden Purchase. Here's the Atlantic and Pacific, which connected all the way to Arkansas. And then in the north, you're going to have a new one called the Great Northern. The Great Northern. And the Great Northern is the brainchild of James J. Hill. And he doesn't seek any federal subsidies, which by doing this, he has like total control over the area. But apparently Hill was quite a smart entrepreneur on top of building the railroad itself, because according to the reading, he goes in and he brings to the farmers along there innovations like better bulls and wheat that will survive in the winter. So in other words, he gives them a way to make money along this railroad that he's building. And so that's pretty smart, And so the railroads are just going to drive enormous demand for resources. If you think about what a railroad is made from, the ties are lumber. And so they're going to have to ship millions of tons of wood from Minnesota. So Swedish people are going to immigrate to Minnesota to chop down trees to ship to the railroads. That's why I think the football team's called the Minnesota Vikings, because so many Scandinavians who are used to chopping down big lumber trees are going to come to Minnesota. Okay. Iron ore from upper Minnesota. Remember the Mesabi iron ore range? Iron is what's needed to make initially not only the railroad line, but to make also the locomotive itself. So this is going to start fueling an enormous demand for resources. But back east, you're going to see a sort of consolidation of what were called the Great Trunk Line. So in the West, initially, the railroads are only used to transport, like resources and commodities. It's not initially designed for like consumer traffic. But in the East, lots of people are now getting from point A to point B by using railroads. So I want you to be able to see all of this at once. So if you've played the Monopoly board, you may recognize this guy right here, right? Oh, sorry. So when you look at, sorry, I messed that up. When you look at these railroad companies, they are predominantly in the region of central to western New York down to Chicago, right? And so that leads to the four great railroads of its day. Now, there were dozens and dozens of railroads, don't get me wrong, but the big four are going to be the New York Central. All right, there is going to be a famous train station built by Mr. Vanderbilt for his train station. Perhaps you've heard of Grand Central Station. That's for the New York Central line. That's what it was built for. So you have New York Central, run by Cornelius Vanderbilt. You have the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio. You can see it here. And then you have the Erie Railroad, which runs from western New York, from Chicago, all the way to the Erie Canal. And then you have the what's called Reading Railroad. Reading standing for Reading, Pennsylvania, not Reading. I've had people play Monopoly and say Reading Railroad. It's not the Reading, it's the Reading. So we call these trunk lines, right? Because they transported goods and services, but also people. A lot of people, and so they were very popular. And ultimately, the figure who came to dominate them all was this fellow, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, his nickname is the Commodore. Does anybody know what a Commodore is? The naval rank, right? Like a naval leader, a captain or above. So how does a train man have the nickname of a boat guy? Well, the answer is that Vanderbilt started out in the New York steamboat business. He ran a steamboat company, which he created basically from scratch. He used to get in fist fights with other steamboat captains to beat them up so he could have the transportation. So he was known as being a tough guy. But pretty early on in this development, pre-Civil War, he begins to recognize that steamboats are the past. The future is going to be in trains. And so he gets out of the steamboat business altogether. He takes his capital and he invests in his first railroad, the New York and Harlem. And then soon he starts buying up other railroads and creating other railroads. And by the time of this chapter, he himself and his son and his family own those 13 railroads. All right, which means they basically control traffic into and out of New York City. At one point, a group of competitors will try to avoid using his trains into New York. So he'll close all the bridges into New York because he owns them. That way, because if you don't use my train, you're not using it. So he owned the line too. And so this guy was extraordinarily powerful. At one time, his son William Vanderbilt is going to say, "Well, aren't you worried about federal law?" He said, "What do I care about law? I've got the power, right? Like you can buy and sell politicians at this will." Of course, many Americans are familiar with the Vanderbilt name. Vanderbilt has a beautiful home in North Carolina. Some of you guys may have been down there to Asheville, right? No, the Biltmore. Yeah, it's a magnificent estate. But he's going to have homes in the Hamptons. So he is going to become the first sort of titan of industry of the Gilded Age. He's going to be the one that other people look to with jealousy and want to be like. So Vanderbilt is by far the most successful of the early railroad magnates, okay, the early railroad leaders. I would definitely know Vanderbilt. All right, here's a cartoon of Vanderbilt, and you can see how his trains are depicted, particularly the Central, as these powerful locomotives. The fellow over there, who actually was one of the few people who was able to scheme on Vanderbilt once, is Jim Gould. You guys remember? Jim Fisk. You remember Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, the Fisk and Gould scandal? So this is Jim Fisk, and what he did was he actually printed stocks of Vanderbilt's railroads and just like fake, just made them up, and then sold them and pocketed them. because there were no federal laws like dealing with any of this stuff. So Vanderbilt and Fisk and many other of the train guys were always competitors, and ultimately Fisk would get shot in the eyeball, but not by Vanderbilt, but by another dude. So nonetheless, the Commodore was the guy you wanted to be on his side. If anybody is curious, maybe you know this or don't, but there's a university in Tennessee named Vanderbilt University. And whenever I see Vandy play on the NCAA tournament, it always makes me laugh a little bit, because the name of the Vanderbilt mascot is the Commodores, and the image is a locomotive. So this is money that Cornelius Vanderbilt endowed for a college in Tennessee, and so it combines both his nickname and trains. And boy, was he an influential figure, to say the least. Very, very wealthy guy. So one of the things that trains initially were kind of people reluctant to ride on trains. They're like they had a nickname of being known as Hell on Wheels. And that's because early on, the very first train exhibit ever in history in England resulted in a fatality. It killed a guy. So you have these huge boilers that are right. It's like a rolling pressure cooker or rolling bomb, and if it's not managed well, it will explode. And so boiler explosions, at least early on, were very common. People were very scared of riding on it because they had derailments quite frequently. Where the train line would break. Iron is very brittle, doesn't make for excellent trains. Like lines, rails. They also, for years, these railroad guys would have their own width of the train, the distance between the two rails. So if you think about it, like that should be the same for all trains, right? Well, they didn't. They had different. So that meant like if you were on one person's train line and then you got to a place where that person didn't own the train anymore, you had to get off and get on a different train just so it would match the gauge. So that's what we call gauge, this word here. And so they developed a gauge that would be the same for everybody. That made sense. A huge invention, and this is so Westinghouse is the guy that's paying for Tesla, right? Westinghouse is the guy that's doing all these neat inventions too. And so Westinghouse had come up with an invention called the pneumatic air brake. And so prior to the pneumatic air brake, you had what were called brakemen, whose job it was to manually exert strength on a train's brakes while it was rolling, right? And so every car had to have a brakeman because each car had to slow down, right? And so imagine being on a sleet or snow-covered night in the Rockies, and you're on top trying to pull the brakes, and you slip, and you fall 4,000 feet. So that it was a very dangerous job, and it frequently, people would see the train, the front would slow down before the rear, and it would capsize, like turn over. So the air brake, which is a wonderful invention, allows the conductor to pull on it, and it sends compressed air through a tube all the way the length of the chain, applying an even amount of deceleration. So you can actually brake slowly. I feel like I'm in a Thomas the Train, but the point is that was a huge invention. So Westinghouse. And then another one was the development of a comfortable riding car. And I know that sounds like, well, gee, obvious, but prior to the Pullman Palace, they call it, the Pullman Sleeping Palace, riding on trains was very, very uncomfortable. Imagine sitting on a bleacher in the football stands while it is bouncing, right? While it's jostling and moving back and forth, and it was very hard. And there were kerosene lamps that would break and set them on fire. And so the Pullman Palace was kind of like I think there's a picture of it in your text. It was a very soft sort of like a lounge almost that you could ride in. So if you were upscale, if you had money, this would be something you would want to ride in because it was like riding first class, the Pullman car. So these were definite improvements. And so what this is going to do is, guys, when we talk about the second industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution is a result of cotton and textiles, overwhelmingly textiles. The second industrial revolution is started overwhelmingly because of railroads. Okay? So the results of the railroads cannot be understated, all right, or overstated, sorry, or they shouldn't be overstated. Either way, they're important. So we call the sort of skeleton of a nation, it's infrastructure, right? This is something that America is woefully behind in now. I had my AP government kids write a letter to some elected official at the end of last semester as part of their assignment. I think half of my students wrote about how awful road conditions are, from potholes to darkness to, well, guys, our trains are, 100 years behind the Japanese and the French. Our cars are becoming obsolete in terms of what resources they're using. But the beauty of the roads and the railroads is it binds the nation together. It pulls the country together in a way that nothing else can. Today, I have flown all across this country now because of the invention of the airplane, right? And that is a marvelous thing, making it convenient. So infrastructure is crucial. Number two, you have Henry Clay's dream. What was Henry Clay's dream? The American system. The American system. Well, now it's happened. The entire nation is one giant marketplace, which means for the only time really in the history of the West, we don't need to export stuff or import stuff. That's one of the reasons why people advocated for such high tariffs, because we didn't need foreign products. Now, need's a very relative term when you're talking about capitalism. But nonetheless, we could survive entirely off of the resources within the United States. That is very hard to pull off, like for any country in the history of humanity. I believe for reality, that's one of the reasons why America is the greatest nation, is that we could literally be self-sufficient. That's extraordinary. This will continue the second industrial revolution's other great industry, which is steel. So the railroads are going to create a demand for new and better metal that iron isn't getting the job done. And so once we find the Bessemer process, once Carnegie and others start selling steel, then that is going to be used to build skyscrapers, railroad trestles, railroad lines, just a wonderful development. And America is the world's greatest steel producer. This will lead people to go further west, to keep going west, to be miners in Nevada, California, Alaska, as well as an enormous influx of farmers into the Great Plains. Urbanization. So people would be, how does railroads create urbanization? Well, if you look at the growth of cities, they're going to emerge along the railroads. So Chicago is going to explode into this huge city, right? This is going to allow people to be transported quicker from from rural to city. And of course, all of this is going to fuel the demand for more workers, right? And the beauty of the second industrial revolution, which is kind of the beauty of today, is there were enough jobs for everyone. The problem with Americans today is we don't want to do some of the jobs that are available. We don't want to work for $7.25 an hour. We don't want to work for meatpacking industry. We don't like that, so we don't want to do it. But the jobs are there. They're available. They're just not the jobs that we all dream we should have. You cannot understate the ecological impact this is going to have. This is going to obliterate, the buffalo herds. It's going to change fundamentally. Like when you see strip mining throughout the West, the railroads are going to carve through mountains. So it's just going to change the very fabric of our country. Let's talk about standardized time. That's another issue that's kind of fascinating. So if you go back to this map that I was showing earlier, one of the great things that came out of the railroads is that they were really tired of what was called local time. So back then, there was no standard time. So every 1,000 communities in America had their own time. And it was impossible to set a time schedule because the time in Danville right now of 2:42, it might be 2:47 in Martinsville. And so what happened is like you would set a time to meet, but people wouldn't know whose time that was on. And so the railroads were like, they're getting snarled up in all these traffic jams and nobody's making this train on time. And so they told the government, we want y'all to fix this. The way to do it is for what? 4 standardized time zones. And once America did this, the globe followed suit. So the reason we have time zones around the world, thank you, railroad companies of the 1870s. Okay, so they standardized the time that you're looking at today. Okay, so definitely be familiar with those. And lastly, the first millionaires in America were the very first millionaires in America made it off of the business of fur trapping. That was a very few people. The second major group were the wealthy landowners and first textile factory owners of the first industrial revolution. So, you know, the richest of the rich Southerners, but there weren't that many of them. But during this period, you're going to see a boom in what the French are going to call nouveau riche, new rich, the new wealthy, the new money. And these are people who are really, really rich. And so, like often is the case when people get really rich who weren't rich before, they are going to live extravagantly. They're going to show it off. You know, and so if you've seen like the movie Titanic, one of my favorite movies about the Industrial Revolution, you've got this really odious fellow named Cal, who's Rose's fiance. Cal's made his money in mining. He's new money. Rose comes from an old English family of wealth whose their money's all gone because it was in land, right? So now there's going to be new money that is the corporate class, you know, the Wall Street class. And they're going to be very, very successful as a result. Now, I mentioned the other member of these two. This guy, Jay Gould, was brilliant at doing several of these things here. So we've already talked about Fisk and Gould as the guys who did the so-called Erie ring or the gold ring. Remember, these are the guys that jammed up the gold market. Here you can see Gould hanging out with James Blaine. You may remember that guy's name, with Boss Tweed and Jim Fisk on the wall behind him, right? And you can see these are guys that are all about ripping off the public, okay? So what were some of the things that Gould did? Well, he was most notable for this first one, stock watering. So if you want to know how companies used to rip off their stockholders, number one is by far the most common way. Stock watering is lying to your investors or to the public about the value of a company. Enron did this, for example. Now, the term itself comes from a trick that cowboys had learned. So when you sell a cow or beef, whatever, you want it to be big and heavy and glossy because you're gonna get paid by the pound, right? So what they would do is they would take these herds and take them past a salt lick. You know, salt lick, like a big block of salt. And the beef would, the cows would lick up the salt, and then they would take them by a giant pool of water. And the cows would just drink until they were so bloated, because they were thirsty. And then you would take them to auction, right? And so you have these big blown up like balloon cows that look sleek and fat. Now maybe they peed it out, maybe they wouldn't. But the point of it is that you were faking the value of the cow, right? Livestock. So we get the term stocks from trading cows, livestock. So stock watering is inflating the value of your company. Like, by the way, today, if you're in a corporation, you have to report your earnings every quarter. They're called quarterly earnings statements. It's the kind of stuff Wall Street loves to watch. Okay, and they're monitored by the SEC, but that way you have a sense of, okay, this is really the value of the company. So like the situation with GameStop the other week, GameStop was never valued what it was inflated to. Like GameStop's going out of business, it's dying a slow death, right? And so it should never be valued very high. But what happened is investors, let's call that word speculators, drove the value of the stock up. They, in essence, inflated it. And so very quickly, once the word got out, look, guys, this is not real money, then the value went away. There is a debate about whether or not Bitcoin is like this. The other day, Elon Musk said he's buying $3 billion of Bitcoin. So if the titans of industry decide to make Bitcoin legit, then it'll be legit. But until then, it's still kind of skeptical for a lot of people. So that's called stock watering, and make sure you know that. And then I've got a list here of other things that they did. And again, this is stuff that Vanderbilt did, Jay Gould did, Jim Fisk did. This is very common behavior. So a rate war is when you're in an area, the airline industry did this. When you're in an area where there are multiple railroads, you undercut your rivals. You sell it as low as possible, the tickets. But you make up for it by jacking up the price where you don't have any competition. So there are some who accuse Walmart of having done this. So like when Walmart comes into a community, they allege they will actually undersell their competition. Like they'll sell stuff cheaper than anyone around. And then once those people are out of business, then they'll roll up prices, is the criticism, the argument. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's certainly true of these railroads. It works, it's just illegal. All right, but it wasn't illegal then. So that's kind of noteworthy. A free pass. So let's say you don't want to be criticized too much. All right, you don't want to be the target of sort of government inspection. Well, let's keep my name out of the papers. I'll tell you this right now: your corporate big dogs, you're really successful, your titans of industry, your kings of economy, do not want to be famous. They do not want to be popular. They want to be unknown. Okay, so that meant giving journalists and politicians free passes to use the railroads. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. Now, I have on here suspend mail delivery. This is a way of sort of sticking it to the government. So the railroad has no obligation of delivering the mail. It's not their responsibility, i.e. they're a private business. If they don't want to deliver the mail, they can say, now you would think the government would have some leverage since they're like, well, we gave you all that land. But no, they just no, we're not doing it. Okay. So that was a big deal. Also, the pool, and this one is really nifty. It almost sounds like something out of Gangsters. The pool is where you agree that y'all will not it's just like a non-compete agreement. So you will have a train in this area, and there'll be no competition, and then you won't compete with your rival in that area. And they did that, and so that way they could both charge as much as they want. They're not competing. And guys, if you know anything about capitalism, you should know that these things violate some of the rules of capitalism. Like you don't have competition, then you don't have capitalism. You have cronyism, or you have, monopoly. So that's what we discover a lot of times about unregulated capitalism is it trends towards this kind of stuff. And then lastly, you undercut your rivals by offering money to people to use your train. Like, in other words, giving them discounted rates secretly. So if I had to choose between the two of you guys railroad and y'all are both selling lines at, let's say, $4 a ton or something, then you secretly say, but I'll give you back 50 cents on every ton. That's a rebate. And so I think I'll go with him. So that's how that would work. And so not public disclosure of your line. There are other things the railroads did that made the farmers really upset too. Like, for example, you had two types of line. You had through lines, which were like going from a long distance to a very long distance. So you could think like from Kansas to California. They would charge less on that than they would on short lines because the local farmer had no choice but to use the short line. That's the only one in that area. The long lines, you had multiple options, right? So they would actually exploit the farmer who had nobody else to choose from. Not like they had trucks. See, we think about like transportation today with tractor trailer trucks, but they didn't exist. So this was a really period where scoundrelism was common. All of that led to a debate about should America do anything about it. So the question I have is, why were Americans skeptical about intervention? They're still skeptical about intervention. Why are Americans not particularly fond by nature of intervention in business? Speak it louder. Well, they're concerned of maybe the slippery slope, although I don't know if that's the case, like, in terms of regulations. The idea that if the government can regulate railroads, they'll regulate me too. But I don't think most people equate the two for themselves. But maybe a philosophy of regulation, maybe that's where you're headed. Like, the government is able to regulate it all, then okay. Yeah, that's a good argument. The argument that is like, well, because the government is regulating this, that makes them more comfortable with regulating. Right. But that's not really the big issue for this answer. Anybody else? Okay, so by this time in American history, Americans had truly embraced free enterprise. Like they really believed in it. And they viewed that if the government tells, that sounds like some Europeans do, right? So that would, they consider that would violate the free enterprise thing, right? And also Americans at this point really still believed in that this was progress. So they weren't at the point yet where the burn was heavy. And I say this about most Americans about most things. When humans, when it's not directly bothering them, then they don't feel much energy to try to solve it. You understand? We would say in governmental terms, it wasn't very salient to them. They weren't feeling the pain. Now, there are going to be a group of people who very much are feeling the pain, right? And they're going to make an argument. But the ordinary American is like, nah, they're just whining. I hear it all the time. When Americans today hear groups that are unhappy about something, they're just whining. You know, it's their problem. So initially, the American public were not very interested in inspecting this or regulating this. And of course, they weren't being informed by journalists much about it, right? They weren't being told by their politicians about it. So it was like not really their problem. And that's where these guys come in. Because for these guys, it very much was their problem. And these are farmers. The real American farmer. And today, when we talk about the American farmer, I have to scratch my head sometimes. I've been to a couple farm aids. I love the American farmer. The problem is almost everything we consume in this country is produced by a factory farm, all right, by Monsanto or Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland. Now, yes, they're family farms. I've got friends that are family farmers, but back then in America, we didn't have agribusiness yet. We just had a whole bunch of farmers, and they were really starting to feel the pain of losing their farms or not being able to get out of debt as a result of this. And so the very first group to try to regulate in any way is the Grange. And they led for what are called Granger laws. So this is a Granger meeting house. The Grange was kind of like the FFA meets the Masons. You guys remember the Masons? So they were called the National Patrons of Husbandry. Husbandry is like farming. A husband is somebody who conserves resources by definition. That's where the word comes from. So it's like the FFA Masons. And they had dances and meetings and handshakes. And this is a quote that I want you to take a look at. So what they figured out was, the Grange, was that particularly in states like Illinois, while they might not get Congress to want to change things, they could get the legislature of Illinois to change things. So let that sink in. They could get the state of Illinois to pass a law. So the state of Illinois is going to pass some laws. And that is going to ultimately go, their law is going to be challenged in the Supreme Court. Okay? The first count in the declaration, which is referred to in this memo of agreement, charged that the Wabash Company is a violation of a statute of the state of Illinois, guilty of discrimination in its rates. That means charging farmers a lot more than through traffic. Okay? They had to pay a lot more than the freight rates of other companies. The court holds this law that said act cannot apply. That act cannot apply, rendered partly without the state, consisting of freight from Illinois to New York. The court holds as a matter of law that it falls within the description of commerce. This is a landmark case. The Wabash case, it's called. Now, Wabash is a river, but this is a company. Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railroad Company. The state of Illinois had passed a law saying you couldn't change rates. The problem is trains don't just stop and start in Illinois. They run through the state. If you know anything about Gibbons versus Ogden, the U.S. Supreme Court said only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. Now, the state can regulate business entirely within the state. I'll show you another case on Thursday, where the court upholds them regulating the cost of rates for grain silos. So the court says you can regulate grain silos located entirely in your state. You can't regulate the railroad, which is passing through your state. All right. And so this case is called the Wabash case. Now, I haven't taught you the case called Santa Clara, which actually precedes this. But what's interesting is that the court here makes a decision not based on the 14th Amendment, not based on the due process or equal rights of the Wabash Company, but rather it violates the Commerce Clause. You understand? So this is an important judicial review, a law, and it means if you're the people that are the farmers, the Grangers and others, then you have to go to who? You got to go to the feds. If the states can't make the laws, then you want Congress to make the law. And so you're going to have a landmark case, an enormous law passed, and you definitely need to know this one. This is the Interstate Commerce Act. It's the very first regulation law in American history. Now, it is utterly ineffective, all right? But it is used by the railroad companies to make life better. But it is an attempt to make life better for the American people. It prohibits rebates and pools. It required public disclosure. So these are progress. Unfortunately, they're not really enforced. The Interstate Commerce Commission doesn't spend any time seeing if businesses are doing this much. But it is progress. And guys, the story of America is not fast forward. It's patient progress. So for these farmers, this is a start. Now, it's by no means the end. But the Interstate Commerce Act is a landmark law, a major bill that will set a precedent that Congress should start looking at the business of business. Okay? All right. Well, we'll conclude with that today. I'll have the test available for you, and then I'll take questions or things like